My name is Sarana Chabi. I'm 29 years old. And the Saturday evening my family held a vote about my paycheck was the evening I finally understood that some arrangements only look like love from the outside. They had set it up like a proper meeting. My Aunt Claudine's living room, which she reserved for important occasions, the sectional pushed back, the coffee table cleared, a legal pad on the cushion beside her. 6 of us, which meant 5 of them and me. My mother, Vera, was on the love seat with her hands in her lap. My Uncle Desmond was in the armchair, with his ankle on his knee, the posture of a man who has already decided. My Aunt Claudine was on the center cushion with the legal pad, a pen tucked behind her ear. My cousins Brianna and Marcus were on the folding chairs they'd brought in from the kitchen, which told me the seating arrangement had been planned in advance. I had been told this was a family check-in. I had driven 40 minutes in October rain to attend what I was told was a family check-in. My aunt opened the legal pad. She said, "We want to talk about the household finances, specifically about how we're managing Saren's income as a shared resource." I said, "My income isn't a shared resource." My uncle said, "It functionally is. You've been contributing. We're just trying to formalize that so it's equitable." My mother said, "We just want what's fair, Saren." Claudine clicked the pen. "We've put together a proposal. Based on your salary, a 40% contribution to the household pool would allow everyone to." I said, "No." The room shifted. Not loudly. The kind of shift that happens when someone says a word that the room hadn't anticipated and doesn't immediately know how to absorb. My uncle leaned forward in the armchair and said, "We haven't finished explaining." I said, "You don't need to. The answer is no." My mother's hands moved slightly in her lap. My aunt set the pen down on the legal pad. Brianna looked at the floor. Marcus looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between surprise and something more careful. My uncle said, "That's a very lonely way to live." I said, "Maybe." My mother said, "Saren, this is your family." I picked up my bag from the floor beside my chair and stood. I said, "I know. I'll talk to you all in the week." I drove home in the rain with the radio on low. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I was something closer to quiet, the particular quiet of a decision made clearly at the right moment for a reason that had been building for a long time without a name. What none of them knew, sitting in that living room with the legal pad, was that I had been the one running the household finances for 2 years. Not informally, not partially, structurally. Every automatic payment that kept that household operational moved through an account I controlled and a card registered in my name. The rent, the electricity, the gas, the Wi-Fi, my mother's phone plan, the streaming subscription my aunt used every evening. All of it on a quiet automated schedule funded by the person they had just voted to redistribute. When I got home that night I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I opened my laptop, logged into my bank, and began going through the list. I should explain who I was before that Saturday because the meeting makes a different kind of sense once you understand the years that produced it. I grew up the oldest of 2 children in a household that was warm and close and financially precarious in the specific way that households are when the adults in them are managing more than the income can reliably cover. My mother, Vera, had worked as a hospital administrator for most of my childhood, a demanding job that she was good at and that paid reasonably, but not easily. My father had been present until I was 11 and then gradually and then completely wasn't. He did not leave dramatically. He receded, the way a tide recedes, a little further each season until one day you look up and the shore is just shore. The financial gap he left was real, and my mother filled it with extra hours and careful accounting and a quality of dignified stress that she carried without complaint and that I absorbed, by proximity, as the texture of what it meant to manage things. My Aunt Claudine was my mother's older sister. She had never married and had lived, for the 12 years I could remember clearly, in a house 3 blocks from ours that functioned as a secondary household, a place where we ate on Sundays, where my cousins Brianna and Marcus grew up, where my grandmother had lived in the back room until she passed when I was 22. Claudine was capable and organized and had the particular authority of the oldest sibling who has always been the one who kept records. She kept records of everything: birthdays, medical appointments, who owed whom from the last family trip. She was not unkind. She was someone who had translated her anxiety about scarcity into a system, and the system had become, over time, its own kind of pressure. My Uncle Desmond was Claudine's younger brother, my mother's brother, which made him technically my uncle by blood rather than by marriage, though in our family the distinction was less relevant than the role. Desmond had worked in logistics management for 15 years, had been laid off 3 years ago when his warehouse operation consolidated, and had been doing contract work since, enough to keep moving, not enough to feel stable. He lived with Claudine. He had been living with Claudine since the layoff, which was an arrangement that had been described as temporary for 38 months. Brianna and Marcus were Claudine's children, 26 and 23 respectively. Brianna worked part-time at a pharmacy and was taking online courses toward a nursing certification. Marcus had graduated the previous spring with a communications degree and was, as of the Saturday of the meeting, working at a coffee shop and applying for entry-level positions. They were both good people in the way that people are good when they've been raised by someone who kept records. They showed up, they helped, they were dependable in ordinary ways. Neither of them had the kind of income that made the household math work, and both of them had grown up understanding, without it being said explicitly, that resources in this family moved toward where they were needed. I had grown up understanding the same thing. The difference between me and the rest of them was what I had done with that understanding. I had worked, carefully, consistently, without drama. I had gotten a degree in operations management on a combination of merit scholarship and loans I'd paid off in 4 years. I had taken a position as a logistics coordinator at a mid-sized distribution company and been promoted twice in 3 years to operations analyst. My salary was $67,000, which was not large by most measures but was, within the context of my family's finances, a number that had a gravitational pull. It attracted requests the way any resource does in a system that doesn't have enough of them. The requests had started small and had grown, as small requests do when they are consistently met, into something structural. I want to tell you what it looked like before I understood what it was, because the meeting would not have happened the way it did without those years of accumulated pattern. When I was young, 8, 9, 10, money in our household was managed the way most things were managed in that house, through careful attention to what was there and strategic silence about what wasn't. My mother did not talk about money the way some parents do, as a constant source of stress to be narrated aloud. She talked about it the way she talked about weather, a fact of the environment, to be prepared for and navigated, not complained about. She paid bills on time even when I later understood that doing so had required choices I hadn't known about. She bought sensible things and did not buy other things, and she moved through that distinction without ceremony. What this taught me was, scarcity is normal, management is virtue, and the people who are good at both do not announce it. My Aunt Claudine operated differently. Claudine managed by system, not by silence. She had a binder, an actual 3-ring binder with section dividers, where she tracked household expenses, contribution schedules, shared costs. She had created the binder when my grandmother moved in because having 3 adults and 2 children in one house required, she explained, infrastructure. The word infrastructure was one I learned from Claudine before I learned it anywhere else. She used it to describe any system that kept a household running. The shared grocery list, the rotation for picking up cousins from school, the informal agreement about who paid which utility. I had thought for most of my 20s that I was like Claudine in this respect, that I was someone who created infrastructure and maintained it. What I understood later was that I had learned her vocabulary without learning her fundamental principle. Claudine's infrastructure was always, at every point, visible to the people inside it. She updated the binder. She called the meetings. She announced what was happening and why. Her system was documented and communal. Mine had become, without my fully intending it, a single operator system that nobody else could read. The distinction mattered. There was a period when I was 26, the year I added the Wi-Fi to my account, when I told myself that I was building toward a conversation. That I was solving the immediate problem now, and the structural problem later, when I had more information or more standing or more of some resource I couldn't quite name. That is the logic that extends temporary arrangements into permanent ones. later never arrived with a clear invitation. I kept solving the immediate problem. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Grace Odieno, who worked in a practice near my apartment and had the quality of someone who asks questions in the key of genuine curiosity rather than diagnosis, pointed this out to me in our third session. She said, "It sounds like you've been treating the symptom because treating the cause requires a conversation you haven't been ready to have." I said, "That's accurate." She said, "What makes the conversation difficult?" I said, "Because the thing I'd be saying is, I have limits. And the implication of that in this family is that I am not as capable as I've always seemed. And the further implication is that some of the dependence that's built up around my income might need to change, which means the people I love will face difficulty I could technically prevent." She said, "Could you technically prevent it indefinitely?" I said, "No." She said, "So, the conversation is going to happen at some point." I said, "Yes." She said, "What's the difference between having it now and having it when you're no longer able to avoid it?" I said, "When I'm no longer able to avoid it, someone else controls the timing." She said, "And when you have it now?" I said, "I do." We sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Something to think about." I thought about it for 4 months. The Saturday meeting resolved the question of timing in the way that a hand forced is still a hand. Not elegant, but final. It began the year I got my first promotion when I was 25. My mother mentioned, in the course of a Sunday dinner conversation, that her car insurance had gone up and she wasn't sure how she was going to cover the gap. I said I could help with that month. I transferred $200. The month after that, she mentioned the electricity bill had come in high. I transferred $150. By the end of that year, I was covering a consistent and growing portion of her monthly costs, not through any explicit agreement, but through the accumulated momentum of individual kindnesses that had been normalized one at a time. When I was 26, Claudine mentioned, also at Sunday dinner, that the Wi-Fi at her house had been cut for non-payment. She said it with the careful neutrality of a woman who has practiced not asking, which is its own kind of asking. I said I could put it on my account. It was $42 a month. It seemed small. When I was 27, Desmond's contract work had a slow patch, and he said, not to me directly but within earshot, that he wasn't sure how he was covering rent that month. Claudine covered it, and then mentioned to my mother that she had, and my mother mentioned to me that the household was under pressure. I started covering a portion of the household expenses, first informally, then, because I am someone who finds informal arrangements harder to track than formal ones, through a set of automatic payments I configured myself, from an account I had set up for exactly this purpose. By the time I was 28, I was running $2,340 a month in automatic payments on behalf of people who had not, in most cases, been told explicitly that the payments were coming from me. My mother knew about her phone plan. She did not know about the electricity or the portion of the rent. Claudine knew about the Wi-Fi and possibly suspected more, but had not asked directly. Desmond did not know. Brianna and Marcus did not know. This was not a secret in the dramatic sense. It was a silence that had grown around a series of practical decisions, each of which had seemed, at the moment of making it, like the reasonable thing to do. I am not someone who plans strategically in the way that stories sometimes suggest, who sees 10 moves ahead and positions accordingly. I am someone who solves problems in front of me and tracks the solutions carefully, and who, by the time I was 28, had built a financial infrastructure for a household that was not mine, funded by an income that was. The Saturday of the meeting was the first time they had tried to formalize something that had been running informally. The legal pad, the vote, the 40% contribution proposal, these were Claudine's attempt to codify an arrangement she had partially intuited but not fully understood. She thought she was proposing that I contribute more. She did not know she was proposing that I continue contributing what I was already contributing, but with the additional feature of having no control over it. That distinction was the reason I said no. I want to be precise about what happened the evening after the meeting because it is easy to tell this part of the story as though it were a calculated move, as though I sat down at my laptop with a plan and executed it. That is not quite right. What happened is that I went home and did what I always did when I was processing something difficult. I went through my accounts. It is a habit I developed in my mid-20s, a kind of financial meditation. Opening the spreadsheet, checking the payments, confirming that what I thought was running was running. On that Saturday evening, I opened it and looked at the column labeled household for a long time. That number, itemized across 7 line items, running automatically, without reminder or request, because I had set it up that way. I thought about the legal pad, about the word equitable, about my uncle's voice saying that's a very lonely way to live, in the tone of someone delivering a conclusion rather than asking a question. I sat with it for a while, not angry, not performing calm, just sitting. Then I went through the list and canceled each automatic payment, one at a time in order the way I had set them up. The rent contribution, the electricity, the gas, the Wi-Fi, my mother's phone plan, the 2 streaming subscriptions. Each cancellation generated a confirmation email that went into a folder I had labeled with my characteristic tidiness, transition. It took 11 minutes. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. I should be clear about something. I did not cancel the payments as a punishment. I want to say that carefully because the sequence of events makes it easy to read as retaliation. They demanded, I refused, I removed the money. Consequences followed. That is accurate as a sequence, but incomplete as a description of what I was doing. I canceled the payments because the meeting had made something visible that had previously been blurry. The household had been running on my money for 2 years without anyone fully knowing it, including me. I had built the arrangement incrementally, in the fog of good intentions and family loyalty, and I had not stopped to ask whether it was sustainable, or whether it was right, or whether the people who were benefiting from it would have agreed to its terms if they had understood them. The meeting forced that question into the open. It answered it, from their side, in a way I hadn't anticipated. They did understand something was running, even if they didn't know the details, and their response to that understanding was to vote to take more. That told me what I needed to know about where the arrangement was heading. Canceling the payments was not revenge. It was accuracy. I was correcting the description of my financial life to match the actual decision I had just made, which was that this particular configuration was over. The payment infrastructure had not been built all at once. It had accreted, the way sediment does, layer by layer, each individually thin, the total depth only visible if you looked at the full column. The year I was 25, my contribution to my mother was 2 payments, car insurance supplement in September, electricity gap in November. Total for the year, $350. I tracked it in a notes app on my phone. I did not think of it as infrastructure. I thought of it as helping out. The year I was 26, the contributions grew, and the tracking required a spreadsheet. The Wi-Fi setup at Claudine's house was the first thing I put on autopay. I chose autopay because I didn't want to have to remember it every month. I set it and it ran. That was the logic. It was efficient logic that had one structural consequence I did not foresee. Once a payment runs automatically, it stops feeling like a decision. It becomes background. It becomes weather. By the time I was 27 and had added the electricity and the partial rent, I had 4 separate automatic payments running from the household account I'd set up, and I checked that account once a month the way you check a car you trust briefly with the assumption that it will be fine. It was always fine. The payments went out. The utilities stayed on. Nobody called to say the rent was late. What nobody knew, what I had not fully articulated even to myself, was that the absence of a phone call about the rent was information. Every month the rent was paid on time was a month in which the household's real financial picture stayed invisible. The automatic payment was not just keeping the lights on. It was keeping the story simple. The story in the version everyone was living was, we are a family that manages. We are stretched, but we manage. Nobody is underwater. This story was true in a technical sense. Nobody was underwater. What the story did not include was the depth of the anchor, holding everything at the surface. I understood this in a clear, explicit way for the first time the month I turned 28, when I pulled up the household spreadsheet on a Sunday afternoon in February and added the column totals. 22 months of payments. A total that, across the full run, would reach $56,160. I sat with that number for a long time. I did not panic. I did not feel the particular vertigo of someone discovering they have made a catastrophic mistake. I felt something more like the flat calm of recognition, of a person looking at a column of numbers she had entered herself, one row at a time, and understanding for the first time what the column meant. It meant that I was the financial infrastructure of a household I did not live in. It meant that the story of We Manage was, in its most material sense, the story of Saren Manages. And it meant that any conversation about changing the arrangement was not a conversation about reducing a contribution. It was a conversation about withdrawing a structural support that nobody fully knew existed. I called Dr. Odieno that week and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. I told her what I had found. She listened. She said, "What do you want to do with that information?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "What would it mean to do nothing?" I said, "It would mean continuing to subsidize something I don't fully agree with, at a scale I can't maintain indefinitely in silence." She said, "And doing something?" I said, "A conversation, a difficult one, with people I love, about something that affects their lives in ways they don't fully know." She said, "When?" I said, "When the moment arrives." The moment arrived 4 months later, in my aunt's living room, with a legal pad on the coffee table and 5 people waiting for me to agree. What followed was not designed. It was simply what happens when infrastructure is removed from a system that has been depending on it. My phone was on silent on Sunday. I saw in the morning that I had 3 missed calls from my mother and 1 from Claudine, all between 7 and 9 a.m. I did not call back. I made coffee. I read. I went for a walk around my neighborhood in the dry Sunday air, the rain from the night before gone, the gutters still running with clean water. I called my friend Tomoko in the afternoon. She was the only person outside my family who knew the full picture of what I had been doing financially, and she had been, for the previous year, the only person who had said out loud that the picture seemed unsustainable. I told her about the meeting. I told her what I had done the night before. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like I took something off." She said, "Good." We talked for an hour about other things. It was the best conversation I'd had in weeks. Monday morning I was at my desk by 8:15 when my work phone rang with my personal number forwarded. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. Then 20 minutes later it was Claudine. I let that go too. At 10:47, a text from my mother. The landlord called. He said the payment didn't go through. "Saren, what is going on?" At 11:12, a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered. It was the landlord himself, a man named Terrence Walsh, whom I had spoken to exactly once before when I had set up the payment arrangement. He said, in the measured tone of a man who has had this conversation many times, that the automatic payment for the Claudine Okafor household had failed, and he wanted to confirm whether there was a bank issue or whether the arrangement had changed. I said, "The arrangement has changed." He said, "All right. I'll need to speak with the primary leaseholder." I said, "That would be Claudine Okafor. I'll let her know to expect her call." He said, "Appreciate it." I texted Claudine, "Terrence Walsh is going to call you today about the rent. You should speak with him directly." She called me 4 times in the next hour. I let all 4 go to voicemail. At 2:15, I listened to the voicemails. The first 3 were from family members whose tone moved through a predictable arc: confusion, then urgency, then something closer to alarm. The 4th was from Claudine. She said, in a voice that was controlled but not entirely steady, "Saren, I don't know what you've done, but the electricity is also not working and I need you to call me back. This is a real problem. We have a family and I need you to call me back today." I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I called Marcus. I chose Marcus because of the expression on his face at the meeting, that moment of something careful, something that looked less like agreement than like discomfort. I had been turning that expression over since Saturday night, and I thought it was worth understanding. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Hi. Is now a good time?" He said, "Yeah. Yeah, it's fine." A pause. I heard about the landlord. I said, "I figured." He said, "I didn't vote." I said, "I know. You weren't one of the 5. He said, "I didn't know it was going to be like that. When Mom said there was a family meeting, I thought it was about Grandma's things. The stuff's still in storage. I said, "It's okay." He said, "Is it?" I said, "It will be." A pause. "I need you to understand something, Marcus. I've been paying for that house for 2 years. Not some of it. Most of it. Your mom doesn't know the full amount, and neither does anyone else." I set it up quietly because the alternative was having a conversation that I didn't know how to have then. I know how to have it now. A silence. I heard him shift on whatever he was sitting on. He said, "How much?" I said the monthly amount. Another silence. Longer. He said, "Does my mom know?" I said, "She knew about the Wi-Fi." "I don't think she knew the rest." He said, He stopped. "I didn't know that." I said, "I know." He said, "What happens now?" I said, "That's up to them. The rent is their responsibility. The electricity is their responsibility. I've been covering both for 22 months because I was able to and because I thought it was helping." The meeting was the end of that arrangement. He said, "They're going to be really angry." I said, "Maybe. But they'll also figure it out. They're capable people." He said, "Yeah." A pause. "Yeah, they are." I said, "Tell your sister I said hi." He said, "I will." We hung up. I made tea. I went back to work. The conversation with my mother happened on a Wednesday. I drove to her apartment, her own place, not Claudine's, and sat at her kitchen table, the same table I had sat at for most of my life, and told her everything. The full amount. The 22 months. Every line item. Itemized, the same way I kept it in my spreadsheet. I did not bring the spreadsheet. I had it in my head. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. Partway through, her hand moved to the edge of the table and rested there, fingers flat against the wood. When I finished, she said, "I didn't know it was that much." I said, "I know." She said, "I knew about the phone." I said, "I know." She said, "Saren, why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Because telling you would have required a conversation about whether it was the right arrangement, and I didn't think I had the standing to have that conversation. I thought if I named what I was doing, it would feel like I was asking for something in return. And I didn't want to ask for something in return. I just wanted to help." She said, "But you were." I said, "I was also quietly running out of the capacity to keep doing it without anyone acknowledging that it was happening." I held her eyes. And then Saturday happened. Her hand pressed flat on the table. She said, "The meeting was Claudine's idea. I want you to know that." I agreed to go. I didn't know what it was going to look like until I was sitting there. I said, "I believe you." She said, "I should have said something different." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." We sat for a while. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator ran. Her hands stayed on the table. I said, "I'll cover your phone plan. Just that going forward. The rest is done." She nodded. She didn't argue. I think by that point she had a clear enough picture of the last 2 years that arguing felt like the wrong shape for the moment. The conversation with Claudine deserves more room than I gave it in the telling because it was the one that carried the most weight, and because Claudine was the one person in the family who was in the most complex position relative to what had happened. My mother had been a recipient without knowing the full picture. She knew about her phone. She didn't know about the rest. Her response, once she knew, was grief and apology. The response of someone who has been protected from information and isn't sure how to feel about the protection. That I understood. I had been operating from a version of the same impulse, the desire to protect people from the difficulty of knowing. Desmond had been, as he said, genuinely unaware. He lived in the house, he benefited from the infrastructure, and he had not known its source. His response was the clean discomfort of a person who has just discovered they have been accepting something they would have refused if asked. Claudine's position was different because Claudine had partially known. She had known about the Wi-Fi. She had known that I had taken on the streaming subscriptions when she mentioned, once, that she was thinking of canceling them to save money, and I had said I'd take care of it. She had known about several of the smaller items. What she had not known, or had chosen not to press into, was the larger structure underneath. I thought about this carefully before I went to see her. There is a kind of not knowing that is active, a deliberate peripheral vision, a choice not to look directly at something that would require action if seen. I didn't know whether Claudine's partial knowledge was that kind or the simple kind. I thought it was probably both, in the way that human not knowing usually is. When she opened the folder at the dining table, I noticed that it had her own records in it, printouts of utility bills, a bank statement, the lease. She had been assembling her own picture of the household finances in the days since the payment stopped, and what she had found was the shape of what had been missing. She said, before I began, "I've been doing my own accounting this week. I think I understand more than I did on Saturday." I said, "What do you understand?" She said, "That the rent has been paid on time every month for nearly 2 years, and that I don't have a bank record of making those payments." I said, "No, you don't." She said, "I told myself it was Desmond covering his share through an account I didn't have access to. I think I told myself that because it was easier than asking." I said, "Yes." She said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes." We sat with that for a moment. The folder was closed now. Her hands were on the table. She said, "When you set it up, the rent, the electricity, did you intend for me to know?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "Initially, no. I set it up to solve the problem in front of me. I told myself I'd explain it later." Later kept moving. She said, "And the meeting?" I said, "The meeting made it impossible for later to keep moving." She said, "I didn't organize the meeting to take something from you. I want you to know that." I said, "I believe you. You organized the meeting to formalize something you half understood. The problem was that what you half understood was wrong." She said, "I thought you were contributing voluntarily, that you'd made a choice to put money into the household because you had enough and we needed it." I said, "That's close to accurate. But voluntarily is the key word. The contribution was mine to make and mine to stop. What the meeting proposed was to remove the voluntary part." She said, "I see that now." She looked at the folder without opening it. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, if I had come to you before the meeting and asked you honestly how much you were covering and whether it was sustainable, what would you have said?" I thought about that for a long time. Long enough that she waited without filling the silence, which was not her natural style and which told me the question mattered to her. I said, "I think I would have told you. I think I was close to ready to tell you. The meeting wasn't the catalyst I would have chosen, but it was a catalyst." A pause. I think I needed someone to force the question into a shape I couldn't defer. She said, "I did that accidentally." I said, "Yes." She said, "I would have rather done it on purpose." I said, "I know. Me too." She opened the folder then, and we spent the next 40 minutes going through her actual household finances, what was owed, what was covered, what needed restructuring. Not because I was going to fix it for her, but because she asked me to help her see it clearly, and that I could do. I am good at seeing finances clearly. It is, among other things, what I do for work. When we finished, she said, "Thank you. For this and for the other thing." I said, "Which other thing?" She said, "The 2 years." I said, "You didn't know about them." She said, "I know about them now." I drove home in the dark. Claudine's street was lined with maples that had mostly lost their leaves by then, the branches clean against the orange sky of a city evening. I thought about the binder, the 3-ring binder she'd had since my grandmother moved in, with the section dividers and the contribution schedule. I thought about the word infrastructure and how differently two people can use the same word. She had meant it to be shared. I had made mine private. We had both been wrong in adjacent ways. I drove home in the dark. It was a Wednesday, I keep saying Tuesday. Wednesday evening. October still, but the end of it. The trees on my block were mostly bare. The conversation with Claudine happened the following week, at her house, and it was different from the one with my mother in the way that a river is different from a lake. Same water, different shape, different speed. Claudine was sitting at her dining table with a folder in front of her when I arrived, which told me she had prepared. She was the kind of person who prepared. The folder had tabs. I recognized the system. I used the same one. She said, "I want to understand what happened." I said, "Okay." I told her the same things I had told my mother, in the same order, with the same specificity. When I said the number, $2,340 a month, $56,160 over 22 months, something happened in her face that I had not expected. Not anger. Something closer to the expression of a person who has just been shown a calculation they had half known was coming but had hoped might be smaller. She said, "I didn't know the rent was part of it." I said, "I know." She said, "I thought." She stopped. Opened the folder. Closed it. "I thought you were supplementing. I didn't know you were primary." I said, "I know." She said, "Why did you do it that way?" I said, "Same reason I told my mother. I thought naming it would change something I didn't want to change. I thought the arrangement was workable as long as nobody looked at it directly." She said, "And then we looked at it directly." I said, "You tried to expand it." She said nothing for a moment. Her hand was on the folder. She said, "The meeting was a mistake." I said, "Yes." She said, I thought we were all contributing to something together, and I wanted to make it more official. I thought it was fair." I said, "I understand why it seemed fair from where you were sitting. You didn't have the full picture." She said, "Do you want me to pay it back?" I said, "No. It was given. I'm not asking for it back." She said, "Then what do you want?" I said, "I want you to know what actually happened. I want you to have that information going forward so that the choices you make about household finances are based on reality." She said, "The reality being that you've been subsidizing us." I said, "The reality being that a choice I made, well-intentioned, not well-communicated, has been masking a gap that the household now needs to address on its own terms. I can't keep masking it, and I won't. But I also don't want you operating for the next year under a false picture of what the finances look like." She put her hand flat on the folder the way my mother had put her hand flat on the table, and I recognized it as a family gesture, something they had both inherited from somewhere, the way of holding a surface when what you're hearing requires physical grounding. She said, "I'll figure it out." I said, "I know you will." She said, "You could have told me." I said, "I could have. I should have. That's something I'll do differently going forward." I meant it, not as a performance, not as the gracious concession at the end of a victory, as an actual piece of information about where I had gone wrong in my own handling of this, not in setting up the payments, but in setting them up in silence, in a way that allowed the situation to drift 2 years past the point where it was still making sense. You can be the person who carries something and also be someone who carried it badly. Those things coexist. Desmond I spoke to last, and briefly. He called me, the only one who called rather than waiting to be called. He said, "I heard from Claudine. I want you to know I had no idea." I said, "I believe you." He said, "I want to help fix it. I've got a contract starting in November that should cover my portion." I said, "Good. Talk to Claudine about the specifics." He said, "Yeah." A pause. For what it's worth, what I said at the meeting, about the lonely way to live, I shouldn't have said that. I said, "It's okay." He said, "It wasn't fair." I said, "No. But I understand why you said it. You didn't have the full picture either." He said, "Still." I said, "Yeah, still." We hung up. I thought about that phrase, "a very lonely way to live," and what it had meant in the room when he said it and what it meant now. In the room it had been a warning, a social pressure applied to make refusal feel like isolation. In retrospect it was almost funny, in the flat way that certain ironies are funny. The person being warned about loneliness was the one who had been quietly paying for the company. 4 months later, Brianna passed her nursing certification exam. She texted me the morning she got the results, a short text, just the news, and a single exclamation point. I sent back a longer reply. We had a phone call that weekend that lasted nearly an hour, and somewhere in the middle of it she said, "I've been thinking about what you did. The payments. And I think you taught me something about what it looks like to carry things quietly. I just want to make sure I learned the right lesson." I said, "What lesson did you learn?" She said, "That carrying it quietly doesn't make it lighter. It just makes it invisible." I said, "That's the right lesson." She said, "I thought so." Marcus got a job offer in December, entry-level project coordinator at a logistics firm. He texted me to tell me, and I called him back, and we talked about the role for 20 minutes with the specific pleasure of two people who speak the same professional language. He started in January. The last time I checked in with him, he was 3 months in and doing well. The household sorted itself out. Desmond's November contract came through. Claudine restructured some expenses, made calls I imagine were uncomfortable, shifted things around, did what she did with every problem, kept records and found a way through. My mother's phone plan continues to run on my card. That one I chose to keep, not out of guilt or obligation, but because it is a small thing and she is my mother, and some small things are worth keeping. The weeks that followed had a quality I hadn't expected. Not the relief I might have imagined, but something more like adjustment. The kind of adjustment that happens when a load you've been carrying is shifted, your posture changes slowly, and the muscles that were compensating begin to release, and that process of release is its own particular discomfort before it becomes ease. I kept going to Sunday dinners. Not immediately. There was a gap of 2 weeks during which I did not go, and nobody asked me to, and I think the gap was useful for everyone. When I went back, the first Sunday, it was to my mother's apartment rather than Claudine's house, and it was just the two of us. She made the food she made when she wanted things to feel ordinary. Rice and stew, the smell of tomatoes and pepper filling the kitchen from the far end of the hallway. I helped set the table. We ate. We talked about work and a film she'd seen and a neighbor's new dog. At the end of the meal, she said, "I want to say something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I know I said I was sorry. I want to say it again in a different way. Not for not knowing. I understand why you didn't tell me. I'm sorry for Saturday. For what I said and what I didn't say." A pause. "You were the one person in that room who should have been asked before any decision was made, and instead you were voted on like you weren't there. That was wrong. I should have said so in the room." I said, "Yes, you should have." She said, "I was worried about the conflict with Claudine." I said, "I know." She said, "That's not an excuse." I said, "No, but it's a reason I understand." She looked at her plate for a moment. Then she looked up. She said, "You're more like me than I sometimes recognize." I said, "How so?" She said, "You carry things quietly because you think carrying them loudly will cost you something." I sat with that. I said, "What does it cost you?" "Carrying them quietly." She said, "Everything you paid for." We did the dishes together. The kitchen was small, and we moved around each other the way you move around someone you've known your whole life. Automatically, without negotiating space. Brianna texted me her exam results on a Tuesday morning in December, and I called her back that weekend. During that call, she said something I have thought about since, that watching me had taught her something about invisible labor. She meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one, and I also said what I genuinely believed, that the lesson worth taking was not that invisible labor is noble, but that invisible labor is unsustainable, and that the visibility matters as much as the labor itself. She said, "That's a harder lesson." I said, "Yes, but it's the right one." Marcus started his job in January, a logistics firm in the city, and in March he called me to say he'd been asked to lead a small project and wanted to talk through how to approach it. We spent 45 minutes on the phone going through stakeholder mapping and timeline structure. At the end he said, "I didn't know this was what you did." I said, "What did you think I did?" He said, "I don't know. I thought it was more like spreadsheets." I said, "It is spreadsheets." He said, "No. Spreadsheets are the output. What you're describing is the thinking." I said, "Yes." He said, I'm going to need to get better at that. I said, You will. You already are. The household at Claudine's reorganized. It took several months and was not entirely smooth. There were 2 utility notices and 1 tense conversation between Claudine and Desmond about the allocation of the November contract money, details I know about only because Marcus told me, and which I did not involve myself in except to note, when he described them, that these were problems the household was capable of solving on its own. He agreed. They solved them. My mother's phone plan runs on my card. That one I kept, not reluctantly but simply, a small choice freely made, which is the only kind I want to be making. One thing I have not said and want to say, the vote itself, 5 people in a living room deciding something about someone who was present, was not the worst part. The worst part was that I had made it possible. Not through malice or naivety, but through the accumulated weight of solved problems and deferred conversations. I had built a situation in which the people around me had genuinely lost track of where the money was coming from. The arrangement had become invisible not because they weren't paying attention, but because I had made it so easy not to. Invisible arrangements have a way of becoming permanent. They solidify quietly, the way ice forms from the surface inward, layer by thin layer, until one cold morning you look down, and what you thought was moving water has stopped. I stopped it before it stopped me. That is the part one am most clear about looking back. Not the strategy, not the paperwork, not the precise sequence of phone calls and conversations. The part one returned to is the Saturday evening. The moment I stood up from the folding chair, said one word, picked up my bag, and walked out into the rain. That moment was the end of the invisible arrangement. Everything else was just the forms that end took. Here is what I know now that I didn't know at 25, when I transferred $200 for car insurance and started a sequence I couldn't have predicted. The people who love you are capable of asking more than you can give. Not because they are bad, but because they are in need, and because need will expand into whatever space it finds available. The space I made available was large, and I made it silently, and that silence was not generosity, it was avoidance. I was avoiding the conversation about limits, because having that conversation required me to say, I have a limit. I am a person who runs out. And I had spent enough of my life watching my mother carry things without running out, or appearing not to, that I had confused her style of carrying with an absence of limits. She had limits. She had just been very skilled at not letting them show. I am not as skilled at that, which is not a failure. It is a fact about me that I have come to consider accurately. The vote in my aunt's living room was not a cruelty. It was an exposure, the moment when an invisible arrangement became visible in the wrong shape, and the wrong shape told the truth about what the arrangement had been. Not a gift. Not an act of love. An infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it runs invisibly, will eventually be treated as whether permanent, impersonal, not belonging to anyone. I belong to myself. I had just needed a Saturday evening with a legal pad on the coffee table to remember it. What I carry now is lighter than what I was carrying then, and I carry it in the open, which makes it lighter still. The automatic payments are gone. What remains is a choice, deliberate, visible, made on my own terms, and that is a different kind of thing entirely. When what you've been giving becomes what you're expected to give, the most honest thing you can do is stop, clearly, and let the shape of the real situation show. It will be uncomfortable. It will be loud, for a little while. And then it will be true. That is worth something. Probably more than $2,340 a month. My name is Sarah Nachabi. I'm 29 years old. I ran 22 months of automatic payments, sat in a room while my family voted to take more, said no, went home, and canceled every one. The rent is Claudine's now. The electricity is hers. The Wi-Fi is on her name. My mother's phone is still on mine because I chose it. The difference between something you carry and something you choose is the act of choosing. I know which one I'm doing now. What you give in silence will eventually be taken in public. When it is, the clearest answer is not an explanation, it is the removal of the thing, so that what was invisible finally has a shape everyone can see. That shape is not a punishment. It is the truth. And the truth, once it has a shape, belongs to everyone in the room. At that Saturday meeting, 5 people voted to make a decision about something that was mine. One person didn't vote. When I look back at the room, I keep thinking about the person who said nothing. If you were in that situation, watching a vote happen about someone else's money, what would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, give it a like. It helps more people find it. Subscribe for a new story every week, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'm Saren. I'll see you next time.